Imagine an entire country disappearing at the turn of the century, a real country, with a national anthem, flag, and soccer team, a country that hosted the Olympics, a country with beaches on the Adriatic Sea, snow-capped mountains, historic cities, a powerful industry, and a respected army. At the time, its population was larger than that of Argentina today. And then, out of nowhere, it disappeared, as if it had been wiped off the map. It sounds like a movie plot, I know, but that's exactly what happened to Yugoslavia, a European country that existed for 85 years and then simply ceased to exist. But how does a country disappear like that? And what happened to the people who were born there? Today, Bello Mundo takes you to the extinct Yugoslavia and reveals the tragedy behind its existence and extinction. Number 1. Before Yugoslavia. Long before Yugoslavia appeared on the map, that region was already a boiling cauldron, a piece of Europe where no one really understood each other and everyone wanted to be in charge. There, between the Alps and the Adriatic Sea, between Italy and Greece, lies an area known as the Balkans. And when you hear that name, you can already think of confusion, because for centuries the Balkans were a real powder keg. It's just that very different peoples have always lived there. People who spoke different languages, followed opposing religions, and had customs that didn't match. Catholic Croats, Orthodox Serbs, Muslim Bosnians, Albanians, Slovenes, Montenegrins, Macedonians, all mixed together, and almost never at peace. And each of these groups occupied a specific corner with its own identity. Slavonia, for example, was located where eastern Croatia is today. Dalmatia, which sounds like a dog's name but has nothing to do with it, corresponds to the Croatian coast bathed by the Adriatic Sea. Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is now an independent country, was already a separate entity back then, mixing Christians and Muslims in the same territory. Who ruled over all this? On the western side, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a pompous European monarchy, controlled the Slavic Catholics and the territories closest to Austria. On the eastern and southern sides was the Ottoman Empire, coming from present-day Turkey. They were Muslims, spoke Turkish, and had conquered part of the Balkans in the 15th century when they advanced across the continent in search of territorial and religious expansion. The result was a pressure cooker. Two empires, various ethnic groups, different languages, religions that didn't get along, and a population divided between East and West. It doesn't take much to realize that putting all of this together in one country would end badly. And it did. Number 2. The birth of the idea. Amidst so much division, a bold idea emerged. What if all these southern Slavic peoples united in one country? That's how the concept of Yugoslavia was born. The word comes from Slavonic. Jug means south, and Slaveni means Slavs. Literally, land of the southern Slavs. The proposal was to create a federation uniting Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, Bosnians, Montenegrins, and Macedonians. These were peoples who, despite their religious differences, spoke similar languages and shared a common history, full of occupations, resistance struggles, and frustrated attempts at independence. But it was only with the end of World War I, in 1918, that the project took shape. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had been defeated. The Ottoman Empire was also collapsing, and in the midst of that power vacuum, the Slavs saw a chance to unite. Thus was born the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, a somewhat clunky name, it is true, but one that already pointed to where things were headed. The main driving force behind this union was Serbia, which was already an independent kingdom and had emerged stronger from the war. They offered the monarchy, the army, and the capital, Belgrade. But not everyone was happy with this Serbian leadership. Croats and Slovenes, for example, came from more developed regions closer to Western Europe. They had spent centuries under Austrian rule. The Serbs, on the other hand, came from a more Eastern tradition, closer to Russia, with Orthodox influence and a strong military history. This difference in origin already raised a red flag. Perhaps this union was more forced than it seemed. But for now, the project was still going strong. And in 1929, the name would finally officially change to Yugoslavia. A new nation was emerging in the heart of the Balkans. But could it really function as a single entity? Number 3. Crisis, dictatorship, and the shock of World War II. On paper, Yugoslavia was a single country. But in practice, things were never simple. Internal tensions began in the early years. The Croats felt suffocated by Serbian rule. The Slovenes wanted more autonomy. Even the Montenegrins, who had a similar origin to the Serbs, began to show dissatisfaction. The structure of the new country was fragile. The constitution was barely able to balance interests, and the parliamentary system was in crisis. As a result, King Alexander I of the Karađorđević dynasty decided to bring order to the country by force. In 1929, he staged a coup d'etat and established a royal dictatorship. He closed parliament, banned regional political parties, and even reorganized the country's map to erase ethnic divisions. All this was done in an attempt to create a unified Yugoslav identity. But this only made things worse. Repression grew. The Croatian opposition became more radical, and the king became a target. In 1934, Alexander was assassinated during a visit to France by a militant linked to Croatian separatists. The king's death came as a shock. The country plunged even further into instability. And as if that weren't enough, came the final blow: World War II. In 1941, Yugoslavia tried to remain neutral, but the Nazis would not allow it. Hitler invaded the country with full force, along with allies such as Italy and Hungary. In a matter of days, Yugoslavia was completely dismantled. Each region fell into the hands of an occupier. Croatia became a puppet state, allied with Germany. Serbia came under direct Nazi control. Bosnia was torn apart by local militias, and armed groups began to emerge everywhere. The country became a battlefield. But amid this chaos, a new figure began to emerge, someone who would completely change the course of Yugoslav history, and who would become almost a myth there. Number 4. Tito, the Resistance, and the Rebirth of Yugoslavia. Amidst the destruction, a name emerged that would become synonymous with Yugoslavia itself: Josip Broz Tito. The son of a Croatian father and a Slovenian mother, Tito was a career communist. He had already been through prison, exile, and military training in the Soviet Union. But it was during the Nazi occupation that he became the main leader of the resistance. While various armed groups fought each other in the chaos of war, Tito's partisans achieved something rare. They united different ethnic groups in a common struggle against the external enemy: Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, Montenegrins, Macedonians, all under the same red flag with a 5-pointed star. And the most curious detail, without directly depending on the Soviet Union. While other Eastern European countries were liberated by the Red Army, Yugoslavia liberated itself practically on its own. With the end of the war, Tito became a national hero. He founded the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia, which would later be renamed the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. It was the rebirth of the country, now as a communist state, but with a unique feature: independence from Moscow. Tito's Yugoslavia became an exception in the bipolar world of the Cold War. It was not part of the Soviet bloc, nor did it align itself with the United States. Instead, it led the so-called non-aligned movement, a group of nations that sought to escape the influence of the superpowers. Internally, the new Yugoslavia was a federation of 6 republics and 2 autonomous regions. Each people had a certain degree of autonomy, but all were under the central control of Belgrade, the capital. The regime was harsh, with no political opposition, but compared to other communist countries at the time, Yugoslavia seemed almost liberal. It had more open borders, a partially mixed economy, and even a vibrant cultural scene. And while Tito was alive, the system worked. But this stability had a name, a surname, and an expiration date. Number 5. The end of Tito and the beginning of the cracks. Josip Broz. Tito died in 1980. At the age of 87, after more than 3 decades in power, he left behind a void that was difficult to fill. For years, Tito's charisma held together a country that deep down lived on a delicate balance. With him in charge, tensions between the republics were stifled. But with his death, the pact began to crumble, and the first crack appeared in the economy. In the 80s, Yugoslavia faced one of the worst crises in its history: foreign debt, rampant inflation, sky-high unemployment. The standard of living fell dramatically, and with it, the patience of the population. The shortage of basic goods spread. There was a lack of food in the markets, fuel at the gas stations, and hope in the streets. Dissatisfaction grew, and with it, resentment between the different regions. Each republic began to look out for itself, and a dangerous question began to arise. Did Yugoslavia still make sense? The Serbs, the majority of the population and influential in the army, wanted to maintain central control. But the Slovenians and Croats, who were more economically developed, felt penalized. They believed they were carrying the burden of the poorer regions, such as Kosovo and Bosnia. It was as if each republic looked at its neighbor and saw a problem, not a partner. In addition, an old ghost was reappearing: nationalism. In place of Yugoslav pride, local symbols emerged: regional flags, separatist anthems, inflammatory speeches. Unity seemed increasingly artificial, and when opportunistic politicians began to use these tensions as electoral fuel, the powder keg was primed. All it needed was a spark. Number 6, when it all started to fall apart. The spark came in 1991, and the fuse was Slovenia. At the time, Yugoslavia still existed on paper, but in practice, each republic was already going its own way. And it was Slovenia, the smallest of all, that had the courage to take the first step. On June 25, 1991, the Slovenians declared independence. It was a bold decision. And of course, it had an immediate response. The Yugoslav army, dominated by Serbian generals, invaded the region, but it encountered armed resistance, and what seemed to be the beginning of a long war lasted only 10 days. Slovenia was geographically isolated, homogeneous, and had a small Serbian population. In other words, it was easy to let go, and that's what Belgrade did. It accepted independence without much effort. But this retreat was not a sign of peace. It was a harbinger of something much worse, because soon after, it was Croatia's turn. And then the story was different. Croatia had a considerable Serbian minority, entire regions where Serbs had lived for centuries. When the Croatian government also declared independence, the Serbs reacted strongly. They said they would not accept living under Croatian rule, and created armed militias to resist. The Yugoslav army once again sprang into action, but now it was no longer to defend a federation, it was to protect Serbian interests. And then what was already fragile broke apart for good. Croatian cities were bombed, entire villages were emptied. The world began to witness the beginning of a series of brutal wars, where the former Union gave way to hatred, ethnic cleansing, and destruction. And most shocking of all, it was only the beginning. Number 7. Bosnia, hell in the middle of Europe. If the war in Croatia already seemed brutal, what happened in Bosnia exceeded all expectations. Bosnia and Herzegovina also declared independence in 1992. But the situation there was even more explosive. Bosnian Muslims, Serbs, and Croats lived side by side, and each group had its own allies, its historical grievances, and now its armed militias. The country became a battlefield, a minefield where neighbors became enemies overnight. Sarajevo, the capital, was surrounded by Serbian forces. For more than 3 years, the city experienced the longest siege in modern history. Constant, daily, relentless bombing. There was no water or electricity. People ran across streets under sniper fire just to get bread or firewood. And every time a bomb exploded and killed civilians, the shrapnel left holes in the ground. The marks were covered with red resin, forming what became known as the Roses of Sarajevo. Stains on the asphalt that still remind us today of the blood spilled on the city's sidewalks. Another symbol is the Sarajevo Tunnel. Dug by hand by residents under the airport runway, it was the only access route to the city during the siege. Food, ammunition, medicine, and people trying to escape passed through it. Today, the tunnel has been turned into a museum and can still be visited. But Sarajevo was just one of many horrors. In Srebrenica in 1995, more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys were killed in a few days by Serbian troops. It was the worst massacre on European soil since World War II, and even today it is remembered as a symbol of the total failure of peace in the region. Meanwhile, the West watched, hesitant, divided, inert. The UN did intervene, but with little real force, and it was only years later that NATO would launch airstrikes to try to contain the Serbian advances. By then, the idea of Yugoslavia no longer existed. All that remained were ruins, open wounds, and millions of refugees trying to survive amid the chaos. Number 8. When the war ends, but no one wins. At the end of 1995, after more than 3 years of horror, the leaders of Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia met in the United States to sign the Dayton Accords. It was the beginning of a ceasefire, the outline of a possible peace. But it also formalized the fragmentation of Yugoslavia, which split into 7 independent countries: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Kosovo. Each followed its own path. Bosnia and Herzegovina was recognized as an independent country, but still faces deep internal divisions. The country is officially one, but remains divided between Muslims, Croats, and Serbs, and any national decision requires triple consensus. It is a cumbersome, sluggish system that prevents more daring advances. Meanwhile, Croatia consolidated its independence and has now become a tourist favorite, with its Adriatic beaches, paradise islands, and medieval cities such as Dubrovnik and Split. It receives millions of visitors a year and is now one of the hottest destinations in Europe. Slovenia has fared the best. It joined the European Union, adopted the euro, has strong tourism, well-maintained cities, and low crime. Visitors to Ljubljana or the lakes of Bled and Bohinj would hardly imagine that this region was once part of a country at war. North Macedonia is trying to establish itself as a nation, but lives in the shadow of disputes with neighbors and name changes. And Kosovo, Well, Kosovo is a chapter apart. This small region declared independence, created its flag, has an anthem, participates in sports competitions, but still lives in diplomatic limbo. Serbia does not recognize the separation, and powers such as Russia and China also refuse to recognize the new country. As a result, Kosovo still does not have an official seat at the UN. Meanwhile, only two countries remained trying to keep alive a kind of mini Yugoslavia, Serbia and Montenegro. For a while, they still used the name Yugoslavia, as if the original country still existed. Then they officially changed to Serbia and Montenegro. This union survived for another decade, until in 2006, it also came to an end. And today, what exists is Serbia on one side and Montenegro on the other. Each country has its own leadership, flag, and representatives. And all this happened under the increasingly authoritarian rule of Slobodan Milosevic. He tried to maintain Serbian influence in the region, but accumulated serious accusations. He was indicted for war crimes, arrested, and taken to trial in The Hague. He died before being convicted. Other leaders were also tried and convicted. But for the civilian population, none of this was enough. No court in the world could repair so many losses. The former Yugoslavia, once seen as an example of coexistence between different peoples, languages, and religions, has become nothing more than a bitter memory, a shattered territory, with new borders, different governments, and open wounds that, in many places, have not yet healed. Today, those born in that country that no longer exists have a different name in their passports, but they carry in their memory a history that the world has chosen to forget. Did you already know this story? Have you ever stopped to think about what it's like to be born in a country that simply ceased to exist? Tell us in the comments. And if you want to continue exploring the invisible marks left by great tragedies, check out the video about Norilsk, the city poisoned by its own wealth. Thank you very much for your company, and see you on the next adventure in our Bello Mundo.